In this examination of the house church movement, focusing this time on opportunities for developing house churches within congregations in our COVID endemic age. I should just mention at the beginning that although I use the word house churches, there are many other expressions which are used alongside that or instead of that. Simple churches, informal churches, basic churches, basic ecclesial communities, etc., etc. All of these refer to much the same kind of thing. The most recent is micro churches. So you can take your pick, but they're largely referring to the same phenomenon. What's interesting, looking back over the last 50, 75 years, is the number of scholars, theologians, practicing pastors, mission practitioners who have gone back to the New Testament and talked about the early church, but also gone to say something about we need to examine this afresh and in some way be influenced by it to do church differently to the way we do it now. I mentioned just a few names, some of which I briefly referred to last time. Anglicans like the very influential missiologist Roland Allen or the missionary theologian John V. Taylor. Lutherans, a very distinguished church historian, the most important in the middle of the 19th to late 19th century, 20th century, Hans von Kampenhausen, and more recently the Swiss missiologist Wolfgang Simpson. Presbyterians like Floyd Filson, who was the very first biblical scholar to draw attention to the early house churches in the modern period. He wrote a seminal article in 1939 which got a lot of other scholars moving in this direction. And then the missionary statesman Ian Fraser, whom I mentioned briefly, from the Church of Scotland. Methodists like James D.G. Dunn, the eminent British New Testament scholar, and also the widely read missiologist Howard Snyder. Some of you know his book, Problem of Wineskins. Baptists like the influential educator Lawrence O. Richards, or a Mennonite in that same tradition, different denomination, Rita Finger. This partly summarises what I looked at last time in the first lecture, but just makes the point. Thomas Lindsay, in his book, The Church and the Ministry in the Early Centuries, a classic work on the subject, said, the meetings of the earliest Christians were held in private homes, and the number of believers grew more. And as that happened, they multiplied into several homes belonging to the brethren. The opposition they faced in the first century was not unlike that faced by Huguenots in their early house churches in the early part of the very modern period. We hear of no office appointed to conduct the services. The Christian community was furnished with its own members, and all felt the opportunity to build up the faith of others. We cannot fail to be impressed by the untrammeled liberty of worship that we see, or observe the confidence with which the Apostle Paul held that if certain broad principles were followed, very little needed to be done by way of specific organisation of these communities. Members of these Christian communities also met together in one place, several groups together at times, where they had a meal, which they themselves provided, and this included a celebration of the Lord's Supper. The apostle was filled with the high rank in which all Christians were raised, being called sons and daughters of God through Jesus Christ. And in his view, the possibilities they had to equip each other through sharing of gifts was highly impressive. It was a real consequence of this that throughout all believers should have the responsibilities of concern and care for the communities in which they lived. My second reference is from James D. Dunn. Paul's concern is of a community of mutually independent relationships. His double emphasis is striking. Each comes with his contribution or gift, and all this takes place with a view to the edification of the others. Paul saw these gatherings in his churches as different from the traditional synagogue meetings, which mostly reflected on God's revelation in the past and how to apply it to the present. In Paul's churches, there was a greater immediacy and expectation of direct divine revelation at points, and some dependency on one another as being the vehicles of God's grace, rather than purely relying upon the Old Testament law and its exposition. There was also the established custom in Corinth and elsewhere of the whole church coming together, eating the Lord's Supper as part and parcel of their meetings. He concludes that we should not see these meetings as simply perhaps happening only in Jerusalem as mentioned in Acts, or only in Corinth as mentioned in the letters to the Corinthians, but there is evidence in the New Testament that they occurred in every place that Paul and also Peter visited. He says, as such, they remain a challenge and inspiration to any group today who seeks to meet together as the body of Christ. So, just by way of, as I say, summarising some of what we saw last time, but noticing how influential Presbyterian and Methodist, of course, along with other denominational figures, have picked up on the early church and sought to ask us and in a way challenge us to take notice of it in our worship today. Last time I mentioned that particular attention has been taken by those in mission contexts in various countries throughout the world. But of course, it's not only in mission contexts that is the case. Also in our own Western societies with more traditional congregations in Europe, Australasia, America, etc., there has been an interest in drawing on the early Christians for how we should reshape our worship today. One of the bridges in doing this in the Presbyterian setting has been, and you may have heard of him, an eminent missionary statesman Ian Fraser. Ian Fraser was a pastor in the Church of Scotland. He founded the influential Iona community off the coast of Scotland, which sought to live simply, work in a enhanced Christian way, and worship together, relying on what each other could contribute to the worship, in a way that drew visitors from all over the world to see how this community, in a rather isolated place, actually functioned. He later, as director of the so-called Scottish Church House, visited around the world, particularly in Africa, in Latin America, but also in Australia, United States and Europe, new forms of church life that were drawing on the early Christian first century experience and seeking to give voice to it and to live it out today. He recorded all these, put them into documents, in some cases into books, and also then took these and what he had learned from them to his own denomination in Scotland and said, we have to listen to what's happening here. God is talking to us. We can't just keep doing things as we have been. We have to also let our own way of meeting together somehow absorb and adapt to what God is teaching these communities around the world. I'll give you 6 or 7 different examples of different ways in which people have sought to implement first century's ways of meeting in their traditional so-called standard denominations. First of all, turning a Bible study fellowship into a small, informal micro or house church. In America, as some of you know, after Sunday morning worship with the whole congregation, large sectors of the congregation break up into so-called Sunday school classes. In reality, they're adult Bible study fellowships. That's what they are. One of these in Los Angeles had done this for many years, but there was some loss of interest taking place, in particular because members felt that their needs were not being addressed in their ordinary life outside the church sufficiently. And as the church Sunday school group wrestled with this, they decided that they would study together the famous book by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Life Together. And they did this for 9 months, every Sunday for an hour and a half. Just slowly went through the book, reading it, discussing it, praying about it, asking God what they should learn from it. And as a result of that, they felt that they wanted to move in the direction of developing the Bible study fellowship more into an informal church, which would not only include the adults, but also the children, not only include discussion, but a meal, not only include both of those, but also sufficient time to work out how what they were learning and what they were relating together could be applied to their life outside church, in the community, in their workplaces, and in their city of Pasadena, as it happened. And they decided to ask in some people involved in house churches to talk about how they were doing this, to see whether they could learn something from that method. It just happened to be groups I was involved in at Fuller Theological Seminary, where several house churches had developed, that they asked to do this. And so we came in for a whole month of Sundays, heard that expression before, a month of Sundays, a whole month of Sundays just to talk about, to share really what we had learned ourselves. Didn't just do this by explaining what had happened, but there were stories told, there were interviews between members, there was role-playing and acting out of how it actually took place with this group looking on, there was Q&A, etc., etc. At the end of that period, the Bible Study Fellowship asked their pastor or pastoral team whether they could test out being a house church as part of the congregation. And the pastoral team said, well, not quite sure about this, but it's an interesting experiment. We could all learn something from this one way or the other. By all means, go ahead. So the next Sunday, they began to meet together, not as one group because it was too large, but as two groups in separate homes, including the children, having the meal, expanding the meeting from an hour and a half. It ended up being 3 or 4 hours. They were enjoying it so much and getting so much out of it. They did this for 2 to 3 months and then reported back to the pastoral team. The pastoral team actually visited both churches at some point during that time to actually see for themselves what was going on. And at the end of it, the lead pastor said to the whole congregation on Sunday morning, this is what has happened, this is what we've viewed, this is what we have decided about this, and if any other Bible fellowship group in the congregation wishes to move in this direction, it has our blessing. A very positive result to a very interesting experiment which those people conducted. The second approach to this whole issue, starting a pilot home church in a traditional congregation. This happened in another city to the one I happened to live in, but I have met the people and talked with them. They were also assessing what they were doing together as a small fellowship group. The congregation had not thought at all about doing anything in a kind of house church direction, but there was a new neighbourhood with a lot of people that were largely unchurched, and this group asked if they could have permission to meet in it. It was on the edge of their own territory, and do so not as just an evangelistic group or a mission group or even just a small Bible study group open to unbelievers coming in, but if they could do it as a house church seeking to also have outreach to the community around about them. The pastor, or the rector in this case, was an Anglican church, gave his blessing to this, and they began to do so. Other people in the congregation were somewhat uncertain about this. It was new, it was different. They were a bit suspicious of the whole thing, thought it rather cliquish, and said so at points quietly to each other and to the rector. But interesting things began to happen. As this group met and began to sort of move into the whole experience, they found that when they went to church on Sundays with the rest of the congregation, they didn't need to hive off and be with themselves. They'd already met with themselves. So what they did was actually give themselves more intentionally to other people in the congregation and to newcomers who were coming into the congregation. And over a period of time, this was noticed. It was not what most people did. Most people after the service hived off to their own little group, their family group, their kind of little fellowship group or prayer group or some other group, ladies group or men's group, met with those people and chatted with them informally over morning tea. This group did the exact opposite. It met with the people that they did not meet with during the week. It met with people who were just new to coming to church. And this began to warm the rest of the congregation to what was happening. And some began to take an interest in what they were doing midweek and saying, well, something's happening there that's actually working and changing these people. And perhaps we ought to think a little bit more seriously about it ourselves. An interesting second little example of what we're talking about. A third example, developing a house church within a non-Christian religious group of people who are becoming converted to or showing interest in the Christian faith. I came across this in, of all places, Marseille in France. Was invited with one or two others to come and meet with an evangelical Protestant community, English speaking in the main. A lot of people were expatriates or were speaking English as a second language because of their work or their marital relationships, etc. And this church, which was growing particularly amongst Muslims who were coming across the Mediterranean from Northern Africa. But the problem was, and some of you who have had close friendships with Muslims knows that meeting in more informal ways with Christians, even becoming Christian informally and quietly is one thing, but doing anything public about it is absolutely another. It's regarded as anti-family, it's regarded as anti-Islam. There's a tendency to isolate you, to separate from you, because it's something which is just not on. It's just not on. And there can be various forms of opposition and even persecution involved. So this church was interested in the possibility of developing within it one or two house churches in which the new converts and the seekers could be gathered just to meet privately in homes, not publicly in a church building, sitting on the street with cars passing by and notices out the front proclaiming as Christianity to all the world. And that's what we were called in to talk about, how house churches might provide the answer to this whole issue. One of the most interesting things was we went away for a whole weekend with this church to a place outside Lyon in the centre of France for a house party. And a day or two into that, the elders of the group said, you know, what we need to do is to see this in action, as well as just hear about it. We're very interested in this. Can we do something about that? And I said, well, as it happens, one of the members of House Church, not in my own country, but in New Zealand, has developed a play which different people can perform, which actually shows everybody else what it is that's involved in being part of a house church. And they said, wow, can you put it into French? Because it'd be much better if we spoke to each other in French. That's our heart language, and the expats all know it as well. And I said, no, I can't, but I can give it to you if somebody can translate it into French. It's on my computer. So they did it. They translated it into French. And they said, instead of just a small few of the congregation role-playing this in front of us, why don't we all do it? All of us, adults, children, men, women. Let's take 3 or 4 hours, have a meeting, include lunch as part of it. And so then we can all not only see what it's like, but we can actually experience a little bit of what it's like. 3 to 4 hours. My wife and I sat there watching them acting this out, not just acting it, but getting into it. And one of the beautiful things was the elders in the church, instead of playing the kind of dominant role and organising everything that went on, they decided that they should play the role of the servants who brought the meal around to the others in the group. Everybody dressed up in first century type clothes with sheets and towels around their heads, so they had turbans, and wore thongs. They tried to get and make some first century type food, which wasn't too difficult because they're part of a Mediterranean culture. And they did the whole thing and found it extremely exhilarating, humorous, serious, and also challenging, and went away determined to try and put this into practice by developing one or two small house churches, especially for Muslim converts and seekers in their own congregation. Most interesting. A different example again. Extending a growing large congregation into home churches in order to cope with just the unexpected numbers who are attending. I saw this in a very large, just a small few of the mainland Chinese city, which I won't name. It was a church in the heart of the city. It had grown very quickly in the early 2000s and beforehand, after the 1990s when things loosened up a bit in China. Had a hard time during the days of persecution, but had responded and developed from that. But there were so many people coming, they couldn't fit them into the church on a Sunday. So the first thing they did was develop more than one service. First of all, they had 2 services, then they had 3, then they had 4. Then they began to have service on Saturday afternoon and Saturday evening. They had so many people coming. But they still couldn't fit all the people in each week because it was an old colonial church. Nice old church, but had limited room. They decided, therefore, we had to do something else, and so they decentralised into what they called home congregations. And they developed these throughout different parts of the city. When I was there were several dozen of them. These people also came together when they could on a Sunday, not every Sunday, because there was not really room for them, but they were part of the big congregation, but also doing what they did as part of the small congregations. I developed close friendship with a couple who were involved in such a group. I was later actually involved in the baptism of their first child in a house church setting. And that's how this group, large church, has maintained its desire to keep growing, but also to keep their members vitally connected to each other and to the Word of God as they discuss it, and to supporting each other and caring for each other through these small congregations during the week. They're now involved in creating a bigger building, and there's been a lot of discussion as to how high that should be with the authorities in the city, who don't want it to be the highest building. They want it to be the highest building in the city. They can get that, but so they're going to have a bigger sanctuary, you might say, but it still won't fit in everybody all at the one time. There's just too many people, multi-thousands of people. In the West, we would call this a mega church. It's not just a small church. Connected a bit with that is my 5th example, decentralising a large church into house churches a bit more radically even. In the Midwest in the United States, in Mennonite territory, there was a medium-sized church, 300 to 400 people, which had many small groups in which not everybody was involved. But as it grew, the bigger meeting was becoming a bit more difficult to organise, taking up too much time of a few people. And the smaller groups, fellowship groups basically, with a little bit of Bible study thrown in, were okay, but not really extending their members very much or deepening relationships greatly for various reasons, only meeting for an hour and a half or something. They didn't have food together to lengthen the time in which they related to one another, etc., etc. And so the eldership decided that what they should do is to try and persuade the members to turn their small fellowships into mini churches, house churches. And so this was done with the assent of the congregation. Mennonites love to work by consensus, not by majority vote, or certainly not by compulsion. It's not the way they work. And so they had the big meeting, and they also had these mini churches, house churches scattered throughout the congregation. They tested this out, worked really well, and about a year or 18 months later, they felt something else was now wrong. And what was wrong was that the house churches were producing people with deeper wisdom, deeper knowledge, deeper pastoral skills, but there was nowhere for them to fully practice them. They could do a whole lot of things now that they didn't do before. And so what do we do about this? You can only use a few of these people in the larger meetings. So what they decided was that they would devolve their large congregation into several medium-sized congregations of around 100 people, meeting in rented accommodation around the city that they lived in, Goshen, Indiana, I think it was, and reduce the meetings of the whole church to once a month or so, or once every 6 weeks, something like that. That is why, because one of the members with great spiritual discernment said, well, I'm a sociologist, I'm also deeply Christian, and what I've worked out is that you can know personally a little bit about and retain the names of everybody up to around 90 or 100 people. Beyond that, you don't know who they are, you don't even know their names. And what's worse, if newcomers come in, you don't know who the newcomers are, so you can't really attend to them. So they split the big church into groups of around 90 or so, where they said even the children then will know the names of all the others, and vitally, the adults will know the names of all the children, so nobody will be unknown to anybody else, and they'll be able to absorb some newcomers for a while. That was a wonderful, profound insight. So that continued, and then the big church just met together every so often for a larger jamboree celebration where everybody could sing songs, hundreds of them, and hear a sermon from their best preacher, etc., etc., etc. That's how that church developed. The sixth example, planting a congregation of home churches in a new suburb. A Baptist pastor in one of our cities was wanting to plant a church on behalf of the denomination in a new area on the edge of the city. There were a few people willing to go with him to do this, and as they talked together, they decided that maybe instead of planting a traditional congregation with small groups, they should plant a house church, and as people were attracted to it, they should just multiply that and have other small groups, but then also meet together as a larger group, but not putting up an expensive new building, but renting accommodation somewhere in order to do that. They needed the permission of the denomination to do this because it was a new thing, nobody had done it before, and the denomination so respected this pastor, he was one of their most reputable people and prized people, that they agreed to it. And this is how things developed. In this new area on the edge of the city, in the hills somewhere, a new congregation developed, first just in a house. As it expanded, it grew into other house churches. As it expanded again, that continued to grow slowly, but also they met together, I think as a monthly or 6 weekly basis. They had a group of people at the heart of it, belonging to some from each of the groups, who met together also to keep tabs with what was happening, to discuss developments, to pray for each other, to talk about any problems or challenges which were appearing or something like that. But that's how they began to not just develop house churches where people knew each other and developed relationships and grew in their gifting, etc., but also were able to develop the nuclei of groups which were able to reach out into various parts of this new housing area, partly old farming area. Number 7, the final one, supporting an independent house church founded by one of the key members of the congregation in their workplace. There are many examples of this I could give. The one that I recall most is in Singapore, where my wife and I were invited into a university professor's apartment. He was teaching at one of the big Singapore universities. He belonged to one of the key churches in Singapore. But he had found through his teaching and developing of relationships with students that there were some interested in becoming Christian and meeting together in some way, but wanting it to be informal and built around the relationships that already developed with him and his wife and with each other. And so a little mini church, you might say, developed in his department, in his apartment, connected to his department, and he wanted the acknowledgement of this and approval of this by the traditional church to which he belonged. And the pastor gave that and said, this is a good thing to do. If we try and just make these people members of the regular congregation, they probably won't all come, or they won't all like it. It won't do what they want to do. Now, in the professor's mind, of course, was knowledge of the fact that this happens in many universities in mainland China. He was a Chinese. This is the way many Christians in China actually, through their workplaces, develop not just people coming to faith, but also helping them to become discipled in the faith and to church together in an informal and serious way. It doesn't just happen in China, it happens outside China elsewhere. It doesn't just happen in educational settings like universities, it happens quite a lot in China and outside China in businesses, in workplaces, exactly the same way. There are many churches which are part of businesses in this and other countries. This is a somewhat different way of doing it. It's not an official part of what a congregation does, but it's an acknowledged part of what a congregation does, because they feel this is the best way in these circumstances in order to proceed at this time. A question arises out of all of this, which I just want to mention briefly, and it could be part of discussion. Surely, if you move in any of these directions, as people have done, if you're a pastor or part of a pastoral team, it's a little challenging because it changes the way in which some things are done. And the more you do it, of course, the more challenging it is, because the structure begins to change, begins to move into a different kind of pattern. So where does the pastor fit into all of this? And it varies depending on the situation, of course, but certainly the pastor has a role in teaching the importance of this. The pastor has a role initially in encouraging this kind of thing to happen or be regarded as okay within the church. The pastor has also the opportunity to belong to such a group, to be part of such a group, to see from the inside what actually happens, and not just be an observer within the group, but actually to benefit from the group, to actually be a recipient of what the group has to offer the pastor. As one pastor who has done this, I have to say the benefits are extraordinary. The benefits are unexpected. The benefits are wonderful. I can't think of any downside to it, why any pastor wouldn't want to be part of such a group. But that's one side. But once a church begins to move, even in a small way, in this direction, there's less for the pastor to do with that group of people. I was with a group of pastors in Canberra some years ago, talking about this kind of thing at their invitation. And there was one pastor who was silent through the whole process, and he was impassive. I couldn't tell what he was thinking, and I thought, he hates what I'm saying. He thinks it's completely wrong. He thinks it's unbiblical, probably. I think he was a Baptist. No, he was an Anglican. It's un-Anglican or something. It shouldn't be done. And at one point I said, of course, when you do this kind of thing, the groups which develop find that they can largely handle their own pastoral issues. I'd say probably 60 or 70% of the pastoral work is done by the groups themselves. He leapt into the conversation. He clapped his hand. He said, no. He said, that's completely wrong. I kind of recoiled into my chair and I said, well, tell us what you mean. He said, no, not 60 or 70%, 90%. I have seen it. I was totally surprised. But the pastor still has an overall pastoral care for those who are most chiefly involved in helping the pastoral care amongst others in the groups. The pastor has a wonderful teaching role to the whole church still, leading them into the Word of God more deeply, and now more in ways which are more applied, because these people want the Word to be applied. They want not just to hear what to believe or what to generally do, they want to hear how it actually affects me tomorrow morning at 9:45 in my workplace when a challenge comes before me and I'm put on the spot and there's a moral issue involved or something like that. They want to know how it actually works in real life. The pastor has a wonderful opportunity. Another pastor I knew found that 50% of his time could now be devoted to things outside the church because the church was 50% running itself without him. And so he began to move out, not only more open to speaking engagements in other places, but also to outreach in his own community, and actually to being a church planter beyond the actual church in which he was placed. There are all sorts of opportunities here. There's no lack of work for the one who God has called to some kind of pastoral teaching ministry. There's only a different form of work, a more expanded form of work. I want to just finish by saying a word about the role of the pandemic in all of this. We tend to recognise that the last 4 years have changed things in some way. We know that most churches have gone along with government regulations and closed down in lockdowns. They've also abbreviated what they do when they're able to get together, sometimes not being able to sing, sometimes having lesser numbers, etc. They have learned in many cases to stream their church services into the homes of believers where a smaller group is gathered safely together. All of this is part and parcel of what's been done. I think there are some ways in which not enough has been done as a result of this. My own assessment of what's been going on in churches, partly through reading and talking with a range of people, is that churches have been more preoccupied with how it affects them, and particularly their meetings and their numbers, sometimes their finances, than they have been with how it affects their most vulnerable members, those who are immunocompromised, those who are aged, those who are even single, living on their own. They've also often been more concerned with their own community than they have with the wider community in which they're placed. Some churches in the US, for example, have opened up food pantries. They've opened up churches for RATS testing, PRC testing. They've made members available to go out and see people who are alone and take food to them, even at risk to catching the virus themselves. In all sorts of ways, they have sought to serve those most needy in their own communities than perhaps many of us have done. And the third thing is that not enough about the actual danger and nature of the pandemic has been talked about in church circles. We're now in a very parlous situation in our own country here, where it's difficult to find out what's actually going on COVID-wise. Even in newspapers and online, which I look at regularly, it's harder and harder to find the actual statistics of how many infections, how many in hospital, how many who have died. That's about the only one you really get, but you've got to search for it. And what makes things more difficult is that nobody's assessing it all any longer. Most of it's down to self-reporting, even by hospitals, etc., etc. Nobody fully knows what's going on. But I know enough from keeping an eye on this, and you may or may not know this, that in the last few months, every week, the equivalent of a small plane load and sometimes a middle-sized plane load of people die of COVID in this country. At the moment, it's down to around 70 or 80. It's been as high as 250 in the last 3 months. It's waxed and waned through various surges of the pandemic. The politicians don't talk about it because they don't want to know that they're not doing enough. The media don't talk about it because they think people are rather sick and tired of hearing about COVID. The church leaders aren't talking about it either, I'm sad to say. And therefore, the pandemic hasn't gone away. The pandemic may have muted in certain respects. We have less infections than we had before. We have more people vaccinated than we had before. But in this last 6 months, we've had more people dying from COVID than in previous years, but nobody talks about it. My assessment is that every week, forget those who have died, which is tragic enough, somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 people are bereaved of a family member. And multiply that by 4 for every month, by 13 for every 3 months, by 26 for every 6 months. It's tens of thousands of people are bereaved and nobody is talking about it. Who is looking after them? In the churches, hopefully that's happening. But what about in the wider community? Is anybody reaching out to them in ways which is really necessary? I just mentioned 2 or 3 before we stop. In a United Methodist Church diocese in South Africa, in one of the larger countries, the bishop has decided that in the course of this pandemic, the whole Methodist Church denomination should move into house churches. The whole church should move into house churches, because that's the only way people can be grouped together sufficiently so that everyone knows each other, everybody can look after each other, everybody can pray together, can learn the Bible together, can sing together African style, dance together, worship together, children included, in a way that cares for every person, but also through their knowledge of their neighbours can care for other people in the villages or towns or cities in which they live. This is the first time I've actually seen a whole denomination in a country decide this is the way we have to go. And he went that way not just because he thought this was medically necessary or socially necessary, he felt it was biblically necessary, because it was something that the early church did, and we need to do something like it if we're going to remain true to our Christian roots. That's the most radical example I've seen of something like this. You also get others like George Barna, the successor to George Gallup, the pollster, a deeply Christian man himself, in the United States, pointing out that not only through the pandemic period, but it's been going on for at least 2 or 3 decades before, less and less people are coming to church. People are dropping away from church who are members of it, but other people aren't coming into the church from outside as newcomers. This, he says, has been an ongoing trend for a generation, and it marks the gradual demise of church as we know it, traditional church. It may not happen today or next week or next year or next 10 years from now or next decade, but gradually church as we know it is not keeping pace with the expanding populations surrounding us and the need that they have. So we have to face up to that, and the best way to face up to that is to go back to the early Christian situation and look at that and draw into our way of doing and being church everything we possibly can from that. George Barna, being a Christian, has done it himself. He doesn't just talk about this or run polls on it and publish them. He's actually part of a community which has done this himself because he felt it was that important. And that's his challenge to the church at the moment. It's giving rise, and here's my last point, to what one writer has called the new house church movement. I'm not talking here about house churches which started in the 60s. We're talking about the missionary proliferation of house churches from the 90s onwards. We're talking about house churches in the 2020s, that partly as a result of the pandemic and people realizing the home or some homely space can be where God can be met each week, and others can be learning together with you and caring for each other with you. We can be eating and building up our relationships, and our children can become part of it. Apart from learning that we can do all that with pastoral help at a distance, but not there every week. We don't need the pastor every week to do this. They're saying, well, why can't we keep doing this? Why can't we keep expanding this? Isn't God saying to us, this is the way to head, not just for our own sake, but or our children's sake for that matter, but for the sake of our neighbours and others in our workplaces and leisure organisations, as a way of drawing them in wherever they are and wherever we are, rather than trying to pull them in every week to this strange building down the road, which they think is odd, and into a culture inside of which they don't know and they feel very uneasy with because they don't feel at home there. They don't know what to do. They're not even sure what they're going to encounter or who might encounter them and pull them into this or that. Let's do it in a surrounding where it's more familiar and has got less of that about it. And he said this is what is developing as a new house church movement in Western countries in particular, US, England, USA, Canada, South Africa. And this is God leading the church into the future. I could say much more, but my time is well up, so I must pause. So thank you for being so patient and listening. I'm interested to hear that, and I did have another example of how a cell-based church did move into becoming more of a congregation of house churches. And I didn't mention it because I wasn't sure how much that was part and parcel of Australian Korean churches. I knew it was part of churches in South Korea itself, of course. I regard the cell church approach to large church as a kind of halfway house to house churches. It recognises the importance of the small group, not just as a point of fellowship, but as a point of outreach as well, which I think is excellent. But where it tends, I think, to become difficult, particularly in non-Korean settings, is the way it's very top-down. And you tend to have not just cell group leaders, a major one and an assistant, but you have zone leaders, and then you have zone pastors, and then you have the big pastor. So its intent is very, very Christian, but its structure in a way is very corporate America. It's not surprising in the way that it had a big kickstart partly in the United States. And so I think the challenge for the cell church pardon me, is to look at that leadership structure and to rethink it in early Christian terms, and to make it less top-down and more bottom-up. There can be people, the pastor and others, involved in supporting it, nurturing it, encouraging it, helping to keep it from straying this direction or that, which may not be helpful, but less from looking down on it and making sure everything is organised and strategised and planned. A little bit more room for the Holy Spirit to surface and bubble up and do what the Holy Spirit does, and to encourage that, maybe refine it at points. So, and the Korean churches have a great chance, I think, to show something to other churches in the West about how that could influence the future. So that's a very interesting example. A couple of thoughts. One is that, in my experience, the hardest challenge, biggest challenge, is convincing the average Christian person who works that somehow they need to give more attention to how Christ wants to influence every aspect of what they do in the workplace. Not just that they should be honest or work hard or be kind or take an interest in other people, but that God is interested in the work itself, the actual work, and that Christians have a chance to ask questions about that, which lots of other people don't, which would actually change the way in which people view work, do work, collaborate at work, priorities at work. Every day as I live, I have to make use of various products produced by a whole range of firms around our country, etc. And I know that there are Christians involved in some of them, and Christians involved in high places even, but there are certain defects of all sorts of kinds in the actual work, the product that they produce, which should be addressed, and the Christians in particular should be seeing ways of doing work better, ways of enhancing work, ways of doing new kinds of work. Technology is the biggest example of this. Technology is running away in all sorts of directions, partly because the Christians are not saying, what is this that we're dealing with? How can we make this technology more humanly considerate, more humanly and communally cultivating, more transparent about the truth, less wedded to monetary and financial making, etc. There's a whole lot of things here. I spent a quarter of my time in this whole area. And it's interesting, going to South Korea next month, I've been asked to speak by various organizations, and virtually all of them, not quite all, want to hear about Christianity and the workplace. I can talk about Christianity community, I can talk about Christianity and spirituality, talk about Christianity and this and that and culture, but they want to hear about the workplace because that is a prime issue, partly because people are spending too much time at it. They're addicted to it. They're becoming kind of idolaters of work and its importance, and Christians, as much as anybody, are in the thick of this, and it's impacting their families, their churches, their whole witness. So I could go on and on, but I'll stop because I've got to be brief. It's a genuine concern, and I have kind of two balancing responses. Number one is, in my experience now over some decades, the more people are involved in house church as parents, the more educated they become in the Bible, in theology, in how this applies to various aspects of life. They read more books, and therefore, as they parent their children, they encourage the whole educational side of things. They know where to point them, things that they might read, etc. That's just number one. And that's the way it's happened for 20 centuries, really. Before Sunday schools ever existed, that's the way Christian parents did it. Anyway, number two, what they also do is not expect their church to do everything. Some house churches have some very good educational programs, but parachurch groups have. There are many groups out in the community. Some have sprung out of other denominations, some not, which are rich in educational resources. Just take the one we mentioned, the workplace. You can look online now, you can find several Christian organisations, not attached to any denomination, who provide a whole range of resources, books, Bible study discussions, conferences, seminars, sermons, focusing on the workplace and how as a Christian you can enter more integratively into it. There are very rich resources for workplace, family, leisure, culture, etc., etc. The local church does not need to provide all these, and it can't do it as well as some of these interdenominational Christians meeting together and saying, let's provide a whole set of materials of a quality kind for those who are interested. There's stuff out there, there's no need to be less educated. Today, Christians can be the most educated people who have lived on the planet if they wish to be.